Good afternoon. Hello, everyone. And welcome to the third seminar of City as Verb, which is a lecture series in conjunction with the Seoul Biennale of Architecture and Urbanism. Today we have the privilege of having a lecture from Geneva, Switzerland, Professor Michael Jakob. And before I introduce him more in detail, I wanted to say thank you to a few people and also introduce our roundtable guests today. So first of all, we partnered with the Swiss Embassy. So I wanted to say a deep gratitude to Dr. Linus von Kastelmeier, who's the ambassador. And we're privileged to have him join us today. Could you stand up for just a minute? And the Senior Cultural Program Officer, Francois Helene, who actually created this relationship and introduced us to Professor Michael Jakob. She couldn't make it, but we also thank her as well. And for our roundtable participants after the lecture, I wanted to first introduce Professor Seung-Hoi Kim, who is the city architect. Secondly, I'd like to introduce Professor Jung Uk Ju, who's also a professor at Seoul National University in the landscape department. And also introduce Rafael Luna, who's a professor at Hanyang University. And finally, Professor Kang Bum-jun from Myungji University is joining us for the roundtable. Could we put on the screen Professor Michael Jakob? Hello, Michael.
Yeah, hello.
Thank you so much for joining us.
Hello.
I don't even know what city you're in. Where are you calling in from?
Well, I'm in the southern part of Switzerland in a place called Ticino on the Lago Maggiore.
There's great architecture in Ticino.
Yeah, a lot. Yeah, it's a place where architecture was always very important, and there is a long tradition. Yeah, we have people like Snozzi and Bacchini and Mario Botta and many other. Yeah.
Well, great. I'm glad you're out there, and I'm glad you can join us today. And so I want to just briefly introduce you. Michael's lecture will be called A Hybrid Territory, Switzerland as a Laboratory for Contemporary Urban Design and Beyond. Michael Jakob teaches history and theory of landscape at HEPIA, the Geneva School of Engineering, Architecture and Landscape, and he teaches aesthetics of design at HED, Geneva. He's a visiting professor at Politecnico di Milano at the Accademia di Architettura, and also a visiting professor at the GSD Harvard as well. His teaching and research focuses on landscape theory, aesthetics, the history of vertigo, contemporary theories of perception, and the poetics of architecture. He produced several documentary films for TV and has a long-standing experience as a radio journalist. He's the curator of the international exhibitions and the author of documentary films on landscape. Please welcome Michael Jakob. And feel free to anytime to jump in and share your screen.
Okay, I will do it. So I hope this really works. Wait 1 second. Yeah.
I can tell you're a professor because you're reading in between.
Yeah. Okay. So here we are. I hope you have communication is okay. I sometimes get an echo, but it should work. So if you hear me and everything is well, I will start. Sure. I'm very happy for this invitation. I think it's always an important thing to be able to give a sort of synthesis of things which happen in one's own country. And this invitation gave me the possibility to come back and to try to put together some elements in order to present what we could call the situation of urban design, of urban of urbanism, but not only of urban design, but generally of the territory and landscape in Switzerland. I take Switzerland as a sort of laboratory in order to show us what kind of problems do we encounter in planning, in different planning disciplines, whether we call it classical planning or landscape architecture or urbanism. So I will start where I want to ask ourselves, where do we stand? Where do we stand in 2020? Where do we have to start? What happens today in Switzerland? And we can take Switzerland as a small mirror for the world and to see where do we go. I use these images in a provocatory sense. This is a famous collage by Yves Klein, the French artist. And this again is a painting by an American painter called Mark Tansey. And I want to ask, one of the things I'm interested to is, do we know where we go with our planning disciplines? We have been so used, starting with the 18th century, and especially with the rationalism of 18th century, and what Enlightenment has tried to tell us, that we human beings, we try to find the best directions, and we find a way in our history. Well, maybe in the 19th and 20th century and in the 21st century, these things are no more so sure. So I apply in a provocative sense this image to our disciplines having to do something with building the future. We all build the future. We build it if we're architects, if we're urbanists, but we build it as citizens too. So do we know where we go? And where do we go anyhow? So to come to really to Switzerland, and to start with Switzerland, I want to go back to the year 2005, where some of the most prominent and well-known Swiss architects, Herzog de Meuron, Miley, and Diener, they published a very provocatory book in 5 small volumes, where one of the central theses of this book was that Switzerland is no more the country which we were used to for centuries. And the general hypothesis, and I think this is interesting beyond Switzerland, is that Switzerland is one big city. Switzerland as a country is one big city. It's a network of cities, and the cities are the real center of what happens in Switzerland. And so if we try to think about the Swiss territory in general, and not only about this and as parts of the territory, we have to see that everything is linked, and that there is a one big city going from east to west, and that in order to cope with urban problems and all the possible problems we have to react to, we have to take into consideration this thorough transformation. So in their maps, this book was very influential, and they showed us that there is a sort of, if you see, from the western part to the eastern, from the eastern part to the western part, from Lake Zurich to Lake Geneva, this is a very highly populated area where you have an ongoing, a sort of infinite city which never stops. And one of the general ideas of this study was, and this is not only linked to Switzerland, of course, is that today we are living in a world, in a situation where everything is urbanized. There is a sort of total urbanization. And so the city is not only where the city is, but the city is everywhere, except one region, which was interesting, and this was very provocatory by these architects who published this region. You see the southern region, which are the mountains, the Alps. They said this is a sort of wasteland. It's dross. It's something abandoned. And of course, people who lived in and who live in this region were quite shocked, because the general hypothesis was, well, it's in the city, and as the city that things happen, everything is urban and will become even more urban. And if you don't live in an urban environment, on the long term, you will disappear. The mountains will become something maybe for some strange touristic reasons, but this was the general hypothesis. This idea is, of course, linked to important developments in the study of contemporary urbanism. German theorists of urban studies and urban reality, Thomas Sieverts, published a book called Zwischenstadt, which is the city in between. And so this in-betweenness was one way to say that the city is everywhere and that the city slowly eats up all the territory and goes everywhere, and that the traditional divisions between the city and the non-city become very difficult. Then we have to think about other philosophers and people who deal with the theory of the urban, like the French philosopher and anthropologist Marc Auger, who in very influential studies called non-lieux, non-places, try to explain us that the traditional divisions between the city, the urban, the non-urban, the natural, we can speak, of course, what is still natural, tend to disappear. And we are living today in a sort of reality where especially these non-places are airports, gas stations, train stations, everything where many people come together. And these are places which have no identity because everything happens so fast. So they are very much linked to the idea of the urban. And so we have an important theory developed around 2000 which relates to this Zwischenstadt, the city in between. And another term was used in Italian by Italian theorists called città diffusa. Città diffusa means a sprawling city. And if you look to Ticino, the region where I'm sitting now, and you look to some places in Ticino, southern part of Switzerland, you see that this sprawling is everywhere. You don't know where the city ends and where something which used to be the countryside starts. And even the countryside is marked by all the qualities which the city used to have for a very long time. So you have all the urban advantages of even in places which are not classically urban. And so this sprawl is very, very strong. And one of the ideas of this book published in 2005 is that this will go on and become more and more important. Now, this is a very important consequence, and I think we have to go back to this famous article published by three of the most famous landscape architects in the United States, Garrett Ekbo, Daniel Kiley, and James Rose, who in 38-39 published three articles. It was called Landscape Design in the Urban Environment, Landscape Design in the Rural Environment, and Landscape Design in the Primeval Environment. And this means until the Second World War, generally speaking, we were used to divide territories in three distinct regions. One was the urban. So we have a history of urbanization, which can take many different forms, but still it was important. We have the urban, which is, of course, very important in the 19th and 20th century. But around it, we have the rural. So we have agro-pastoral tradition. There is something which was very important. Of course, there was a dialectical relation between the urban and the rural, which made it possible that the city survived because it was always using its rural environment in order to get food and et cetera, et cetera. And then around 1945, so if we take the end of the Second World War, we still see the existence of some primeval nature. And if we take into consideration Herzog-Domeron's study in 2005, well, their idea was this doesn't exist anymore. There is no such thing as nature. Nature is no more there because we change even nature. So everything is intermingled. So I would start, I think this is an important general idea in order to take into consideration the hybrid quality of the territory. Hybrid means that we cannot anymore distinguish in a classical way the urban, the non-urban, the man-made, and the natural. Everything is mixed up. Everything is hybrid. And this means that we need new tools. And this means, too, that for everyone who does planning, construction, design in a given place, for example, in Switzerland, you cannot start with the traditional concepts which we used for centuries, which is, for example, the existence of nature, the existence of wild or primeval nature. So let's go into a second chapter I want to open, and because we deal with Switzerland. Now, the idea of Switzerland is very often linked to some cliches. People, when they think of Switzerland, think about landscape and they think about mountains. And they think about mountains in a very passionate way. And I want to start with this very famous painting by Conrad Vitz. It's a religious painting, of course. At that time, most of the paintings were religious. And Kenneth Clark, the great British critic who in Landscape into Art said, this is a very first painting in the history of painting, probably in the history of painting altogether, where we can identify a place, because this is Lake Geneva. So the Bible, this is history of the Bible, where we have Christ. And so Jesus produces miraculously, he gives the fisherman the possibility to fish a lot of fish, etc. But he transposes this in a real place. And the real place is Geneva, it's Lake Geneva. And what I start with this because you see the mountains behind you would see Mont Blanc if we would have a very good reproduction. I start with this because if we take into consideration nature, the idea of nature, which is still very much present when we deal with the imagination of Switzerland, even in a touristic sense. Millions of people come to Switzerland because they want to see nature. But what is nature? And what about nature in the history of Switzerland, in the recent history of Switzerland? Well, we have to start with the idea that nature for a very long time was negative. Mountains were interpreted as places where the devil and not God was at home. And this is, of course, linked to the Christian tradition in Europe. So we have two very important episodes in the Old Testament. The first one is, of course, Paradise Lost, Adam and Eve. You remember, God created a perfect nature. Everywhere paradise was the Garden of Eden. And then Adam and Eve betrayed God. And the next morning they have to leave when Archangel Gabriel says, well, now it's over. You will have to work. You will die. You will have to suffer. There are always all kinds of sufferings. And so then there is a second episode which is much more important, and this is a great flood, or what we call the Great Deluge. So the Great Flood is God, once the first humanity betrayed him, decided to destroy the first world, which was a sort of paradise, and 40 days of rain, everything was destroyed. And until the 18th century, everyone, even very, very instructed people who were scientists, they actually thought that the age of the Earth is 14,000 years. 14,000, its theologians have calculated that the Great Flood has taken place some 14,000 years ago. So 14,000 years ago, history started. And history started as a catastrophe, because the catastrophe was the destruction of the world by God with 40 days of rain, which created a sort of new topography. And generally speaking, everyone believed that we live in a world, and especially in a nature, which is negative. Hence, we have the idea that mountains, the mountain regions, are full of devilish forms. You see, these are illustrations of the 18th century of a very important author who was a physician. He was scientifically and mathematically extraordinarily well instructed. But he said, be careful, if you go to the mountains, these places are full of monsters. So the monsters were a sort of personification of all the bad forces which exist in nature. And in the 18th century, something very important happened. And this doesn't relate only to Switzerland, but it relates to Europe, and we could say even to the entire world. So some very important changes happened, and they were linked to intellectuals, poets, philosophers like Albrecht von Haller, who was a mathematician and a very famous scientist of the 18th century. And he was one of the first one who said, the Alps, the mountains are not really beautiful. They're really ugly. So at that time, people even thought, even someone like him, he thought the Alps are ugly, but they are useful. They're useful because they're full of water, and the water, he was one of the first who understood the hydrological cycle. Water is useful for life. And so slowly the interpretation of the mountains, of a bad place occupied by the devil, something which is sort of divine punishment, started to change, because the Alps, this poem by Haller, was translated in many languages. And another even far more influential person, again, a Swiss intellectual, I'm sure you know him, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who was, of course, a citizen from Geneva. He was educated in an urban environment, but in a bestseller which he published in the 18th century, La Nouvelle Héloïse. It was a novel. It was a sentimental novel. And the main figure in this novel says, the only regions which I find beautiful are the mountains, the Alps. So you see, Rousseau was at the beginning of a change in the interpretation of nature. So if we look globally, we can say from the Middle Ages until the 18th century, nature in Europe in general and in Switzerland specifically was something negative. And then slowly from the 18th century on, people started to understand that nature is something positive. Then we have another very important current which intermingles, which comes together here in the 17th, 18th century, is the aesthetics of the Sublime. The Sublime is an antique theory which was modernized, we could say, by the British. And then the Sublime, the idea of the Sublime is nature which is extraordinarily big. And you see how painters of the 18th century got the sense of this fascination, which was unnatural. People had to learn to love this kind of nature, because if you are exposed to a nature like this one, where you see the human beings are just tiny, they're small, and nature is huge. So we have a sense of admiration of nature. But this admiration, to be interested in nature and in wild nature, is not natural. It's man-made. So this was a cultural phenomenon. People were taught how to see sublime beauties. Here you see how the first tourists came in the 18th century, especially in the Bernese Alps and the Swiss Alps, and generally to the Alps, and they made drawings and they wrote poems. And so they started to work on the transformation of the idea of nature. This is again 18th century painting where you see the reproduction is not very well, but you see at the left corner, there are two persons who are drawing. They are drawing this incredible glacier. The idea is come and admire wild nature. So wild nature became a fundamental theme. And then you see here one of the results of this was that Swiss nature in the 18th century became absolutely central into the intellectual discourse. For example, in the 18th and 19th century, every educated person would immediately have recognized, oh yes, this is a Staubach. It's a very famous waterfall in the near region of Bern. So there was a sort of transformation of the ideas of nature which took place. And this is very important to take into consideration. Just another very short example, the so-called chalet, the chalet or the mountain cottage. Until the 18th century, no one was ever interested in this kind of architecture. This was non-architectural. This was because it didn't fit into the Vitruvian classical idea of architecture. This was a construction of poor people, and it was designed poorly in a classical thought. And then in the 18th century, everything changed. And this became fashionable because people in the city, so urban intelligence, they started to be interested in. And then you could already in the 18th and 19th century order copies of this kind of architecture. So it is as if you would take a piece of Swiss nature and reproduce it. And the reproduction of pieces of nature, of pieces of a natural environment, went so far that even these descriptive places which were described in the guidebooks, people started to imitate them. So if you go to Windsor or if you go to France, some new gardens in the 18th century picturesque style, they imitated real places in the Alps. So you see the interpretation of nature changed completely. And you see here this gathering and you say, wow, this is a wonderful piece of nature, where it is actually not. It's a sort of collage. It's a machine. It's in a garden near Paris. So you see how the idea of nature changed, and this is very recent in the 18th century. So we have to take into consideration these things where we deal with a territory like the Swiss one, which is very, very marked by this very dense history of recent changes on a very large scale. And in the 19th century, these changes were even more powerful and even more important because we have the construction of a new landscape, which is a landscape made by artifacts. So architecture comes into the high mountains. And you see these hotels, which gave the bourgeoisie, the people who could afford to come here in the 19th century, the possibility to safely look around and participate in the wonderful spectacular view of the Alps. But in order to do it, you see the intervention is very, very heavy. So people transformed very, very heavily the environment which we know. The train, for example, very quickly, just 15 years or 20 years after the invention of the railway system, people started to work on projects in order to build the railway. So if we look to Switzerland today and we say, oh yes, the country is still has a very important part of nature. But what nature do we speak about? Because you see here, nature, of course, these Alps are natural and they're geologically very old. But we have very recent interventions like the train system, or even more important, hydroelectricity. Hydroelectricity changed completely the topography of Switzerland and of many, many other countries around the world. You see, this dam, it's higher than the Eiffel Tower in Paris. It took 15 years to build it. And today we have people, many, many people come up here and they want to look to the Alps because to be on the dam makes it more interesting to look to the Alps than the natural view. So you see hydroelectricity and then the rail system and the railway system or the traffic system. You see, this is Swiss nature today. Okay, but what is natural? What is man-made? You see, it's a very, very complicated balance. And of course, in the history of engineering in the 20th century, this was an important theme. And again, when we speak about nature and the discovery of nature, this is nature too. But how natural and how unnatural is it? And I think for design, especially for every design discipline, call it architecture, call it urbanism, call it landscape architecture, it's very, very important before starting to get a very clear conscience that the concepts we're dealing, as I said before, you know, nature, for a lot of time you use the concept of nature. But what do we mean when we think about nature today? So, for example, today, millions of people come to the Alps and they want to have vacation here, etc. But the Alps, they're this too. Though the Alps are a very, very complicated system where man-made structures and infrastructures are very present. And they completely change the history of the territory. So we have to look to this in order to understand the place we're speaking about, because a country is a very, very complex system. And as every other country around the world in the 20th century, Switzerland was very much marked by what we could call utopia. So the automobile possibility, the possibility to cross the country and to be everywhere when you use cars. Now, I want to come to a third element before looking to some contemporary examples linked to, and some contemporary problems linked to urban design. Urban design in Europe. Let's say urban design in Europe. Now, Europe is arguably quite a special place if we look to the general context of world history, and if we look to the phenomenon of what we could call the urban, so the city. And I start with the famous image of the 14th century, around 1350. This is the Siena, it's called the Bongoverno, it's in Tuscany. And I show it because there is something happening between the 12th and 13th century in Europe that is the city, the urban environment is thought of as a work of art. This means that there is an investment into the beauty of the city, and the beauty of city is guaranteed generally by architecture. Architecture is used in order to make the city more beautiful. What does it mean? This means that the houses have a front view, which becomes more and more important, and there is decoration, and there is a possibility to transform these places, which are spaces which are used, as in every other country in the world and every other culture, but the beauty of the place becomes important. So if we travel in Europe, and of course in Switzerland too, but everywhere in Europe, you will see that the city becomes a sort of aesthetic project. And this means that people from the 12th, 13th century on invested a lot of money in order to make their houses not only comfortable and safe, but beautiful. There was a sort of informal competition. And this is very, very unlike other traditions. If we look to China, and of course we know how important Beijing was already 2,500 years ago, with extraordinary architecture. But the architectural, the beauty of the city and the beauty of the buildings was always inside. It was hidden. From outside, you don't see things. Because there is an idea too that public space may be always dangerous. So it's better not to show too much, not to show off. On the contrary, in the European tradition, we have the development of urban space where especially the main street in most of the important European cities, we could count between 3,000 and 5,000 of these cities. The main street becomes a place where you show who you are. This is the city of Bern. The city of Bern in the Middle Ages is, of course, a city which is closed by fortifications. And so the fortification gives, in general, to the European cities a high degree of coherence, because everything had to happen inside the fortified city. And then there was the possibilities. You have the city walls, they're opened. In some cities, you have one opening, one gate. In some, you have two. In some, you have four. And so you see here the city of Bern, and you have a central axis. And in this central axis, you have the most important houses. And in the last 500 years, we have a sort of coherence here. So even in a contemporary photograph of the 70s, here, 70s, 80s, we see that the main street, the urban construction is marked by this this idea of transforming the city, the urban environment, in something beautiful. And the beauty is linked to some idea of order. The city is ordered. Nature is disordered. The city is ordered. It's like a garden, like a classical garden. You have to bring some order in it. And you see the order is the main axis, for example, here the transversal, the diagonal, or it is the order which comes through the division into islands, or the division in the sense of repetition. So this is taken into consideration because it's not only, it's all about Europe, where we have this structure. So you see, if we look to a plan in Bern, we had these almost repetition where you have a more or less the same structure with commercial spaces. And I speak about 14th, 15th, 16th century. This is a very old system in the front row. And then you have a sort of regular system. And if we look to other places, this is Geneva, the old city of Geneva, because in Geneva too, the main city was in the old city. And you see, this was the main street in Geneva for centuries, until the 18th, 19th centuries. So it was full of palaces, high palaces, because the most important families, those who had the possibility to invest in these things, they created something which was quite regular. The height and the organization of the space was regulated. And only in the 19th century and the 20th century, there was a new main street. This is the new main street in Geneva. And you see, even if this is a sort of mixture of many different architectural styles, we have a sense of a homogeneous space. Of course, this is 20th, 21st century. We have the tram, we have new things appearing. But we have a sort of step from this one. This is the Middle Ages. There is a sense of homogeneity. And then we have here the new main streets, a little higher with different commercial buildings. So that's how the city is developed. So if we come back to the idea of the European city, you see the European city is normally fortified and it has an ordered structure. The ordered structure, the well-ordered structure is very often the Roman structure, the old Roman structure with two crossing lines. That's how the Romans created their cities. But I'm interested in a general sense of this rule. So if you take Paris, you see Paris was an ordered city inside of the 20 arrondissement, which fitted into the fortified city. And you have two axes, and the city is something regular. This is very important in order to understand the history of urbanism in European cities. And even once these borders and this frontier of the fortification will disappear, it's important. And then, of course, when the cities became richer, they had to add new places. And again, you see very well here, this is an important idea of the European city. In order to show that you are someone, that you count in the world, you invest in architecture. This is still ongoing in the world. If we think about the star architects and this and that city which are looking for star architecture building, or in order to say, I want to have a Rem Koolhaas building too. I want to have a Herzog de Meuron building. And this becomes very strong in the 18th century. And in the 17th century, this is Genova in Italy, the Via Nuova. But we find it in Geneva too. You see, Geneva, to come back to the city of Geneva, this is the old city in Geneva. And when you have important palaces which are in the main street. And then in the history of urbanism and recent urbanism, the idea of uniformity becomes important. This starts in the 17th, 18th century in Paris, where you see that the new buildings, the buildings start to be more or less look the same. So for a very long time, for centuries, there was a general idea, urban environment can be a mixture of very different kinds of buildings. And from the 17th, 18th century on, we have a sort of rationalization and almost a standardization. And then the result, you see it again in Geneva, because my main theme is, of course, Switzerland, where you see how there is an imitation of the uniformity of architecture in one of the important streets of the city. So an imitation of the Parisian model. And of course, we have then many phenomena, which I will come back to, because, for example, the green spaces in European cities become very important. This is Berlin. So to have a green space, to have an urban promenade will become important. And here you have the urban promenade in Geneva, Promenade de la Treille, where you see the society, the people who really counted in the 18th century city of Geneva. In order to have free space, they would come and walk here in this alley. So we have here a new element, the green space in the city. Of course, as long as cities were fortified and there were wars, you couldn't develop really very generous green spaces because everything was needed to survive. But once a city starts to transform itself and become the modern city, and the fortifications will disappear. By the way, the French word boulevard comes from the German Bollwerk, and Bollwerk means fortification. So the fortifications we'd made the structure of European cities for centuries, for 700, 800 years, they started to deconstruct them in the 18th century, and then they became very open green spaces. So Switzerland is very much part of a history of urban development, where we have very important places in the city, like the main street, the facades, the main places of the building which look to the main street. We have marketplaces. For example, this is a marketplace in a classical Italian Tuscan marketplace. And here you see the marketplace where the marketplace used to be in Geneva. Now it's the heart of the old city, where very often we have a fountain. So, and this gives us an idea of the structure of the city. By the way, and this is another theme, I will come back with my contemporary examples. You see, this is the plan of Geneva, and in the southern part, you see the old city and what used to be the old city. And then the more we go to the lake, the more everything is recent. Lakes and the lake shore didn't interest anyone until the 18th century. The lake was used for transport. The lake was not beautiful. It was not considered beautiful. It's only around 1800 that people started to be interested in the lake shore. So it's a very recent development. Until then, the lake was something used for. And then with this modern use, the cities changed. And so we have the discovery of the lake shore. So it's important to understand that the city, the urban environment was there was an idea of order. So already the theorists and architects of the 14th and 15th century start to think, how can I give a perfect form to the city? There is a lot of work done in Europe. And what is important is this idea of order. A beautiful city is a well-ordered city. It has to have a structure. And you have to have the possibility to orient yourself. And you have to be it has to be possible to distinguish the marketplace from the main street and so on. Now, how do we apply this to contemporary problems? So I call it some themes and problems in modern urban environment. And I will start with something unusual. So I try to put together 5 or 6 themes because we don't have infinite time, and maybe it would be interesting to have some discussion. The first theme is infrastructure. Infrastructure means that the country is a grid. A country is a network. And so where infrastructure is very important. This is, by the way, a fundamental idea. If we look to the history of landscape architecture, think of Olmsted, who is arguably the first landscape architect in the world. And we know that he's not only the author of Central Park in New York, but he's the inventor of the parkways. And the parkways developed by Olmsted, think of the Emerald Necklace in Boston, think of the parkway system in New York, means in order to well design a territory, even an urban territory, you have to create a system of parks. So you have to be very, very strong when dealing with infrastructure. So therefore, infrastructure is a fundamental theme. And I start here with something which you may know. This is, again, in Ticino, in the southern part of Switzerland, where I am now. It's Rino Tami, an engineer architect, who shows us that infrastructure is very important. Sometimes, so Switzerland is a place where you have these strange things, that there is an investment. Some people would say even an over-investment in things which normally don't count. Who cares about highways? Who cares about the design of highways? Well, Swiss architects and Swiss engineers and Swiss landscape architects very often care about it. And I think this makes the quality of general design, especially in a context where we cannot say anymore that this is outside, that this is inside, because as I told you before, starting with the Herzog de Meuron study of 2005, the city is everywhere, the urban is everywhere. So I think infrastructure is fundamental. And I like to show these examples too, because it has something to do with details. I think there is a Swiss tradition in dealing with details. We could call it a good design. I will show you one of the most important and most famous forms. So the good design has to be everywhere. Even streets, even architectural or technical elements are important because they transform the landscape. Anyhow, the presence of this infrastructure transforms altogether what used to be natural. But if we do it, we have a responsibility. So we have to have a sense of form. And here you see Rino Tami in a book by Kenneth Frampton, where we see how this very important author, he really had a sense of the responsibility of engineering. I stress engineering because we have never to forget that 99% of the buildings in the world are not built by architects. So 99% of the buildings worldwide are not built by architects. And so engineers have a lot of responsibility, and happily so, in Switzerland, we have a very important tradition of engineering. And if we look to the infrastructure, we see, and this is an example, it's a highway around Geneva. And it's a sort of périphérique. It's a highway which goes around, it's an orbital around Geneva. And you see, this was the first landscape architect in the western part of Switzerland, Walter Brugger, and he designed this. And so at first glimpse, you say, well, it's just a street, it's a highway with a little greenish stuff. Well, no, it's very complicated because first of all, even the bridge is a sort of example of engineering as design and good design. And then you have this green, so the presence of different plants here is very well studied. So for me, this is an important example of how you care about things where landscape architecture has to be very, very invested, especially in infrastructure, because infrastructure is something which is massively present. And so landscape architecture is not only about gardening, not at all. It's about being everywhere. By the way, when I say landscape architecture, I don't want to argue, I'm not interested in the divisions between architects, landscape architects, urbanists, and so on. I'm interested in about what happens on the territory. So I'm not interested who is the author. It's not about being part of a syndicate or being part of a club. It's about what are you doing? And I think in Switzerland, different professions work together in order to create a reality which has a quality of engineering, a quality of design, a quality of ecology, and so on. So you see here, this is how Walter Brugger back in the 70s, and this was revolutionary. No one wanted at first to invest in this kind of stuff because they said, well, we build the highway, it's already costly enough, it's complicated, let's stop there. And he said, no, we have to make green corridors. Green corridors because nature, trees, etc. have a lot of value, aesthetic value, biological value, ecological value, and so on. So infrastructure, well, this is not very, you don't see it very well, but when I told you that this has a tradition, the tradition is a design tradition of Switzerland, and this is a very famous designer called Max Bill. Some of you may know the watches designed by Max Bill. Many architects like to wear these watches, and this was Max Bill with one of his projects. Very, very famous designer, and he was a teacher too in different academic institutions. And he published a book on the good form. And in the good form, he showed small examples and big examples. And the most important, the big examples, important examples are, for example, bridges. We have a tradition in Switzerland of building bridges, and a tradition which is living on. It's an ongoing tradition and of very high quality. So if you see this again, and we come back to something which I tried to show in the second chapter where I was speaking about the history of discovery of nature. This is a Simplon, when you go to the Simplon Pass, and it's a wonderful bridge built by Christian Men. So you see how a piece of engineering actually transforms nature. Or we see the famous Maillard bridges, which everyone knows, which were worldwide examples of how to build elegant bridges and to transform landscape. Or we have more recently, by your concept, an engineer in Chur, in the eastern part of Switzerland, these wonderfully light bridges, which actually are a way to interact with with nature all around. So infrastructure was the first chapter I wanted to speak about. The second chapter is, well, places in the sense of the Italian piazza. So places which are the heart of the city. And I chose the first example, which is in a small city near Lausanne. It's called Renan. It's not a very well-known city. And you see a lot of modern building, more or less banal. But you see what has been done here is to open up the space. So I think modern urbanism is very much linked to the necessity to create free space, to create and not to fill up. Architecture worldwide, partly engineering too, fills the world up with buildings. We need buildings, factories, hospitals, schools. Most of them we really need. Some we don't need. And maybe some of them we don't need where they are. But this is another problem. But architecture generally builds the world up. We fill up the world with objects. I think public space has to go the other way around. We have to take things away. So the project of this place at the heart of the small city was about creating void. Creating void is very important. Of course, this is a general trend. It's not only in Switzerland. If you go to Barcelona, you will find many examples. But I think this in Switzerland, it's very much present. And there is a sense of restraint and of which is very much present. And then there is another thing which characterizes urban space in Switzerland is a very high quality of material. We cannot stress enough this. There are not many places in the world. Of course, some people will say, well, Switzerland is a very rich country and you can afford this. Okay, but there are places which can afford things and where terrible things are done. So in Switzerland, there is a very, very high quality of the material use. And this means too high quality of the project to take your time in order to find the right solution. So you see here granite and the mixture of the research of very, very high concrete, quality of concrete. And then you have these pergola style elements, and generally not to fill up the space, to be able to go around. And if we go to Zurich, Tessiner Platz, another central part of Zurich, which is the economical capital of Switzerland, and you see how contemporary design makes these small interventions. And they're, I would say, almost poetical. I mean, you have a sort of rhythm of these elements, and they're very light, only 2 or 3 benches, and then you have this structure. And there is an idea behind it. There is no such place in the city which is not worth that we invest something in its beauty. So this is a contemporary form of this very old tradition of the city beautiful. Make the city beautiful. Try to design and to redesign the city. And of course, in the 20th century and the 21st century, this is a contemporary form. It cannot be the form which we used to have for hundreds of years because we live in another world. So it has to deal, it deals with the artificiality of the modern city, but at the same time, it is something very strong. Or another place you see even more spectacular in its void, it's in Zurich too. And you see how contemporary urban design, of course, we have the historical buildings, we won't touch them because there is a sort of protection and there is an idea that they're part of the historical, generally of the history of the city, and we have to protect them. But then you have this wonderful opening, and you have again one of these open space. Public space is so important, not to privatize place, to have public space which is open for different uses. And again, where you have this very, very beautiful and simple material, and which becomes a theater. The city becomes a theater. And you find it in another place, smaller place in Zurich. You see, we have benches, because benches are a way to recognize that people can sit there and they can look around, and it has something to do with the scopic qualities of the city. So this was the second theme, places in the city. A third theme, very, very quickly, one of the important themes of contemporary design in Switzerland in the last 25 years was cemeteries. Or cemeteries are interesting because, again, we can ask ourselves, well, this is a luxury. We have already to build so many things and they're so expensive. Why invest into cemeteries? But cemeteries are important because there is a place where societies renew themselves by recognizing where do we come from. And so you see, this is a famous example by Dieter Kinast, was a very, very important Swiss landscape architect. It's a cemetery in Chur. And then we have another cemetery you see in Zurich. It's very, very near the city. It looks far away. It looks like being outside in another world. But at the same time, we're at the heart of the city. So creating green spaces, whether they're parks or cemeteries, is very important. And so we have a whole tradition of creating and of looking for these things. Again, I think I show it to you because for me, all of these examples taken together, whether infrastructure, cemeteries, places, etc., are the expression of the responsibility of the designer. This is another cemetery near Bern in Könitz. You see, we are responsible in creating something which is beautiful and will stay beautiful. So we create green spaces, for example, in cities. This is very important as a modern topic. Nature in the city. When you see this image, you would say, wow, this is wild nature. This is somewhere in the incredibly, miraculously survived region of nature. It is not. It's in the heart of Zurich. It's a park of the Zurich University. And you see here, ASP, Landscape Architecture Studio, built a revolutionary park, because what they did, they took, there was a lot of leftover material of construction, especially stones, and normally people would take it away. And already back in the 80s and 90s, they started to create a park where you take what is left over and you integrate it into your project, which first of all looked like a provocation, but now it seems to everyone like something revolutionary. And I would say this is one of the first really ecological projects in urban design. And I say urban design because it is in the heart of the city. You see, here is another glance of the same park. You see the buildings of Zurich University and a small lake. So you can build parks in a new language, because you see here there is a language of the 20th century and of international style and of many, many things which happened. And at the same time, you can have a new relation with nature. And if we look to green space in the cities, and if we could make a trip in the city of Zurich, for example, we see how green spaces take very, very different forms, like this one. But we have always this sense of a dialogue between nature and its other, technology, the city, artificiality. Again, here in these projects, so I could show you many, many of these projects with this sense of empty space, or in some places which are even more banal, where the reality around was very banal, and everywhere this desire to create empty space, and at the same time, some small islands where you can have a rest and this sense of very, very high and very exquisite knowledge, technological knowledge. And you see these green spaces, even the wonderful park I showed you before, the Ursa Park in Zurich, once it was done, it looked like this. So this is man-made nature. This is not nature. This is man-made nature. This is artificial. But you see here, this is almost, I think, a very, very strong image for what we call Handwerk, handicraft, the craftsmanship in Switzerland. And it's a craftsmanship which makes the Rolex watches, but it's a craftsmanship, it's a craftsman too who makes landscapes, buildings, architecture. You see this possibility to really design things in this way. Yeah? And then almost the last theme, because I think time goes really quickly by. Something which became very important, of course, in a place like Switzerland is the lake shore and the river shore, because Switzerland is full of lakes, and the lake shore, as I told you before, only from the 19th century on did it become an important theme. And then in the last decades, 20, 30 decades, people discovered the lake shore. The luxury to have a lake where you can swim, where you can walk around, where you can do many things. And so this became a very important theme. And in both urban and landscape architecture studies, we can see how there was a real discovery of this. And this is the city of Lucerne. We can see how the partners, urbanists, landscape architects, and architects work together in order to create a sort of green system, and how you can transform a city which is very, very traditional. I mean, it has a very long story, and everything in the old city, everything is protected, and at the same time be innovative. And you see, this is Zurich, as I told you, the economical capital of Switzerland, and that's how it becomes in the summer. And this was, again, an important project. It didn't look like this for a very long time. And then it became an important urban project to transform the access to the river, to give the possibility of access to the river. And you see how this is designed. And of course, this is not only a Swiss example, but this becomes more and more important. I think in the next future, this will to take the car, everything which is disturbing, and to give the people the possibility to interact with these kind of environments, which are, especially in this COVID time, absolutely essential, because it's a possibility for people just to find free space. And then you see many, we could make a long trip and see how the lake shore or the riverscape and the river shore becomes a very important theme in order to design urban reality, and where again you have an example of good design. So use the best possible design even for the objects, whether they're fountains or benches, in order to create something which is always an expression of quality. And it's not only the case in Zurich, it's a case in Basel too. So very recently Basel was really transformed, and you see how Basel, which is a heavy industrial city, of course, with a wonderful old city, how the riverscapes become really the place where everything happens. So I think this is a very, very good metaphor of the transformation of the urban environment in very recent times. This is 10 or 20 years ago. And my last image, well, it's not, you don't see it very sharply, I'm sorry, but it's an image of Zurich. And you will understand what I want to say. I think maybe the single most important element in the good design of the urban environment, and as we saw, urban is everywhere, the urban is everywhere, even in the ski stations, even where we don't think that it is urban. Well, the single most important element which gives quality, provides quality to the urban structure is the quality of architecture. And I think in Switzerland, we're quite lucky to have something extraordinary. We have a very important middle class, architectural middle class. I think for a country, it's not important to have 2 or 3 star architects. Every country can have it. But in order to have a very important middle class, hundreds and maybe thousands of architects, which all do very good architecture, well, this is an extraordinary chance. And I think it's a quality, it's a general quality of architecture, which is maybe the most important element, because of course this reality we are faced to is always marked by the presence of buildings and by structure of buildings. And I think there is the sense of responsibility of most of the Swiss architects in order, how do I transform the world in designing and by designing, and how do I interact with other architects, and what am I as a designer in something which is bigger than me, which is the urban environment. Okay, that's, I think, what I wanted to say.
Michael, thank you. Yes, thank you so much. And you gave us a lot to think about. We usually take a short break, but I think we have a lot of momentum. You sort of pushed us over the edge with so many great ideas. And I really love the way you speak, actually, because it's both theoretical and historical, but it's also very accessible. You know, we can understand it. You know, it's not, and so the way you framed the story is actually quite amazing. So thank you for that. We're going to start our round table, and I want to invite our first interrogator today, city architect Professor Seung-Hoi Kim.
이렇게 만나 뵙게 돼서
It's an honor for me
반갑습니다.
to meet you.
이렇게 스위스를 가면
When we visit Switzerland,
풍경 속에서
sometimes we tend to compare the landscape of Switzerland with the landscape of Korea, saying that it's very similar. And it's always a very great moment. And during the presentation, I was able to learn a lot about the history and the situation of Switzerland, and it was a very interesting presentation. As you mentioned, the most important thing in the city is the quality of the architecture. That was your conclusion, and I fully agree with you on this point. Several years ago, architects from 15 different countries dined together, and they had a discussion about which country had the highest quality of architecture between themselves. And the answer was Switzerland. Switzerland had the highest quality of architecture for them. So, as you said, Switzerland has the greatest quality of architecture and has some of the greatest cities in the world. I fully agree with you on that point. And my question to you is, when we look at European cities, including Switzerland, and when we look at Asian cities, including the city of Seoul, there are many similarities, but there are also many differences. As you said, in the European civilization and European culture, there is a dichotomy between nature and the city, between good and evil. So there is a kind of a duality within the European system. And that is how the European civilization was born, based on this dichotomy. But in the case of Asia, it's a bit different. Of course, there is a duality, but we have a different system. We have the yin and the yang. So that's a kind of a dual contrast. But we also have the concept of the human, the sky, and the earth. And we also think about the four seasons. And we also look at the universe, the trees, fire, and water, and the different materials to look at the circulation of the universe. And we would like to create an order of the universe within the city in the case of Asia. For example, in Seoul, we don't think of the mountain as something that is in opposition to the urban city, but it's part of the urban city. And I think that's why we translate things a bit differently. And we don't have enough housing in Seoul So we have a discussion about whether to free the green belts around Seoul so that we can build more houses. But the citizens were opposed to that, so we decided not to do that. So there is an ongoing coexistence between the nature and the city. So when we look at the cities of Asia and Europe, there are differences, and because of that we have different cities. But recently, after the mid-20th century, we see cities becoming more and more similar and converging in Asia and Europe, because the border between the rural and the urban is disappearing, and we see a new paradigm that we need in this new age. And this is something that we are faced with together. And amongst some of the issues and challenges that we both face in Europe and Asia, I think is the following. We have to think about IT and telecommunications. Alvin Toffler, in the 1980s, through his book, The Third Wave, talked about working from home and decentralization. And in 2020, with the COVID-19 crisis, we are experiencing a totally different urban life. And as you mentioned in your introduction, the city and architecture, we need to think about solutions for the future. We need to look towards the future. So in this situation, we have the climate change crisis. We are living the pandemic of COVID-19. In this current situation, what should humanity think about and focus on right now? In the 1980s, Alvin Toffler said that we needed to think about technology and telecommunications and that it had to be at the center of cities. But what about now? Since you are from Switzerland, a very advanced country, when we think about the future, what is important for us in the future? What should we focus on right now? I would like to hear more detailed explanations on this.
Okay, so thank you. Many things, many important things which you mentioned. First of all, I want to say that last year when I spent 1 week in Korea, I had very much a sense that Korea is a place where the things will happen in the really already happen and will happen the next time. So I saw a quite extraordinary quality of the young existing architecture. So I think you're really on the way, if you're not already fully in creation of what I called this architectural middle class. So I was really very much surprised, and I really admirative for what I saw, especially in Seoul, where I walked one day, I think already even 29 kilometers walk in order to really see what happens. I think you're completely right with the idea of the differences in the European history versus history in Asia, and even the history in Asia is you have to subdivide it in the history of different countries and so on. And this is very important, I think, because difference is fundamental, especially if we start. So first of all, the difference is very real. I remember that I was quite shocked, especially in Japan. I was quite shocked when I visited some places where I saw some wonderful gardens of the 16th century, which are very, very famous and which are recognized by everyone. And as such, and in the immediate vicinity of it, we would have some buildings or even some really extreme examples of very bad engineering, one next to another. And in a European tradition, we have this way to say we protect, maybe we overprotect some places, and then everything which is not so important, we put it very far away and we hide it. And I think in Asia, as you said, it's very different. So there is a very different way to deal with this separation between things, as you said, the good and the bad, the evil. For me, this is important for one, especially today, because I think the single most important danger for planning, especially for urban planning today, is standardization. Standardization means that the urban environment of cities worldwide look more and more the same. You open your eyes and you are in a country, but you could be everywhere else. And we have a sort of new international style, which is very often a sort of poorly designed international style, where everything looks like everything else. And I think if you ask me what should we imagine, what can we do, we should preserve something which is local without being poorly regionalistic. We have to somehow find ways in order to work against the extreme standardization, which is, for example, the standardization of piazzas, of places, where most of these places you have the same brands, you have the same buildings, you have very often the same architects. So I think here there is a responsibility to develop a language, and I think this is a real difficulty, which is both local and global. And maybe the one thing which one can learn from Switzerland is, it's, you know, when you said those things concerning Switzerland and the Swiss tradition, of course, I think there is a very high quality, but it's not that it comes from a history, as I tried to show. And I think one thing which is important when we look at the Swiss example, that there is a sense of modesty. So there is a sense what I call modesty or restraint, so that architects or everyone who is doing design in Switzerland has this sense of responsibility because what as designers we do, we change the world. So let's take our time. Let's do things slowly. And you asked me what, especially today in 2020, what do we have to do? Well, I think we have to really take our time. We don't have to rush. And of course, in Switzerland, this is maybe possible because if I compare an architectural studio or a studio in urban design in Switzerland with other countries, we have an economic situation where people have the time in order to work out parallel solutions, in order to take time. And then we have a political process too in Switzerland where things take time. Sometimes quite a long time. But I think time is a very good judge. So let's not overreact it. We know that in some places around the world today, people try to build in an incredible speed. We see capitals and we see urban environments which didn't exist 10 or 20 years ago and which are there. And I think if we compare it with the Swiss tradition, well, these are two ways to work. And maybe if we find a way to work between the two extremes, change the world very, very quickly and take your time in order to do good design, this would be an important argument for the next future. So it's not to imitate some Swiss solutions, but maybe the Swiss way to work, which means let's respect the political processes, let's discuss. So I think there is a good tradition. For example, one thing which is very important, which is, of course, has nothing to do with this form, we have in Switzerland a very, very, very strong tradition of architectural competitions. And the architectural competitions, which of course means landscape architecture too, and urbanism, and etc. I think this is a guarantee, if you do it well, to have results which are really excellent. And I think, especially in a moment like this one, where the normal reaction is, well, this is an emergency and we have to react immediately. No, because we are in an emergency, we have to sit down and we have really to prepare the city of the future and the territories of the future and take really the time to reflect, which means that especially all of those who are teachers and have to come together with professionals and with everyone who's interested in the urban environment of the future. And I think everyone is interested. There is no one, if you do a good project for participation, everyone will be interested.
Great, thank you. It's very interesting that you brought up the idea of competitions, and when you visit here, when the virus has gone away, or when you get a chance to visit, you'll see some of the efforts that have recently been happening. Actually, Professor Kim Seung-hoi has been spearheading a whole bunch of competitions, and some of the ones in this exhibit are about layering, working with infrastructure, layering around it, on top of it, below it, with public spaces and landscape urbanism. And so not rejecting that infrastructure as bad, but actually layering onto it. So hopefully some of these things will be built and we can walk through them and give you more things to lecture about. You can theorize with it with us. I'm wondering if I can also now invite Professor Chung Uk-ju to make a comment.
네, 안녕하십니까.
Yes, good afternoon. Thank you for that inspiring presentation. Coming far from Switzerland, I actually felt like I was a student all over again in graduate school. It was good to feel like a student again, as if I was in graduate school studying with a great professor. Yes, Switzerland is somewhere where I just briefly visited, and I didn't have a chance to walk 29 kilometers. I took the automobile and just zoomed by the beautiful nature. You mentioned earlier many things about the Swiss cities, and it was very interesting. Compared to us, it seemed like you have such beautiful nature, almost to the extent of being unrealistically beautiful. But listening to your story about the cities, I realized that cities will always be the same because people are living in it. The relationship between cities and nature also defines how we should build the urban environment that I found very interesting. I was also very impressed with the thing you said about the hybrid territory. If I put my own interpretation on it, you've been talking about the city and nature, and you said that the combination of infrastructure and landscaping is coming together. It's no longer dichotomized as it was in the past. It's now being layered. And with that layering, it's creating a new city, if I understood correctly. You can put nature and city against each other, but you could also look at the cultural differences between the two countries. I used to think a lot about why can't we do it when Switzerland does it, but nowadays I think more about the differences in the culture. We're different from Switzerland. It has to do with cities versus nature, but also between business versus art. These are conflicts and harmony that take place within the space of the city, and it results in a city built by us. Listening to your lecture, I thought about the city of Seoul, where I'm living in right now. On one hand, I am envious because you have a continuum of architectural history, the history of nature and the history of humanities have been continuing on without any disruption. But in the case of Korea, we had a significant disconnection, for example, the Korean War or occupation by another country. As a result, there has been some disconnections and the ride wasn't smooth. And a lot of times, what I see now is a very haphazard outcome, not something that was carefully planned. Now the architects and landscape architects are coming together to build a city, but we're still affected by those two major disconnections. Oh, it would be nice if we had time to move slowly, but you know, the Koreans are very, very impatient. We have to be fast at everything we do. We can't change who we are. So even though we move fast, at least we can refer to other countries and make sure that that is incorporated and offsets what comes from fast speed. The Swiss Alps was very beautiful. Korea has many mountains as well. Seoul is surrounded by mountain, and that is one of the reasons why Seoul was selected as the capital. As a result, there are many natural elements in the city that was fused with the many artificial elements as Seoul developed. I thought about the potential assets that we had. It could be the surrounding mountains, the rivers, the natural environment, many things that we can enjoy. But since we were so fast-paced in our development, we really didn't appreciate those assets that we had. It's now time that we reflect upon that. Until now, we were so busy building and building, but looking back at what we've done, we realize that the city of Seoul is filled with buildings. You said that it is time to take away things, but how can we take away buildings? We can't do that, but at least we can take a pause, slow down our tempo, and think about how we can combine what we have with what we can have and build a hybrid territory. Perhaps it could be in Garden City. Garden is somewhere in between artificial and natural, but we can imagine the future of Seoul as a garden city. That would be making the best of what we have as potentials and combining that with the assets that we have. At least we can imagine our future as such. And I thank you for giving me this food for thought.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I have a lot of echo from the translation, but I think I got what you want to say. First of all, I would say we're all students, and I think this is an incredible chance because we have always to start again. So we're never bright enough, and it's a chance where I always thought it's a real chance to be able to go back to the fundamentals, and we have to start at zero again. And if you're a teacher, it's even more so your responsibility. Concerning Switzerland, we don't have to misjudge the country. Switzerland until 1900 was a particularly poor country with a very, very important immigration. So the idea of Switzerland as something, as this extraordinary paradise is something constructed. And it's only partly real. So we don't have to forget that there was a misery too, and especially that maybe one of the things which made Switzerland strong is that having no natural resources, nothing at all, the only natural resource was intelligence, imagination. And Albert von Haller, this scientist from Bern and poet who I mentioned, already said in his famous poem, The Alps, we don't have anything. We have only stones and water. But because we have to face this sense of restraint and we have to respect things which are rare and which are not given, we learned how to resist. So I don't think any country in the world, you spoke about Korea with its tragic history in the 20th century and not only, of course, I think every country has its different sites and different traditions. So we don't have to forget this. And Switzerland is layered too in this sense. And then there are many, many things which made Switzerland being what it is. For example, even the history of tourism, the place, many, many people who came from Switzerland and made Switzerland what it became. So it is hybrid not only in the territorial sense, in the sense I suggested that zoning is no more possible, but it's hybrid in a historical sense too. It's more complicated. And I'm sure, of course, that Korea is infinitely complicated. And maybe architects and planners have to teach that sometimes it's not very good to be impatient, because once you build a building, as you said, it will be there for a very long time, and it's very difficult to take it away. So we have a real responsibility in order to intervene too quickly and to find the right process in order to find the right solutions. Do I still hear you or not?
An echo. Are you hearing an echo from us right now?
Yeah, I hear you. Yeah. Okay.
Okay, great. Could we have a comment from Professor Rafael Luna, please?
So first of all, thank you again for your wonderful lecture. I agree with John that it was very accessible and at the same time academic. And I want to agree with you with the current state of urbanity of the 21st century, that we have these conurbations of never-ending sprawl that happens worldwide. It's not just the Swiss condition of the Switzerland as one mega city, but we see it in Seoul as an expanding city, and same in Tokyo, Rio, East Coast in the United States. It's all over the world. And I agree that maybe as architects or landscape architects, the role that we should take is on how to organize this urbanity. So in that sense, I wanted to ask you about this last second part of your lecture, which had to do more with the void, in the way of how do you actually see it in playing a role in organizing these conurbations? Are the voids taking an active role in organizing the city, or are they reactive in just offering relief from the conurbation? Because especially for the Swiss landscape, I see it that there's two scales, which happens across most Swiss cities. There's the urban scale that lakes and mountains organize the city. So Bern, for example, the shape of Bern is because of the river. And I love this last image that you show, even though it's pixelated, but it shows that point that the form of Zurich, it stops at the lake, same Geneva, Lugano. So there's that big void, the urban void, that actually forms or stops the conurbation, which are the lakes and mountains. And then you mentioned the smaller scale voids that offer this relief, which are the parks and plazas. But those don't really work as a network. They don't organize the city in a way. They just offer a relief. They're not like the London Square that actually organized London. So that was my question. How do you see that happening in the Swiss landscape? Are these two scales of voids actually working that way? Is the small scale an active or reactive participant? Or is the geography what forms somewhat of the nature of landscape urbanism?
Well, I think it's linked to something very recent, which happened just in the last decades. It's linked to the rise of landscape architecture as an important partner in the planning of the country. Historically, in Switzerland, landscape architecture was always a poor guy who came after the architect. So the architect would build, then you have the urbanist who made the system, and then we would say the landscape architect would come at a certain place and they say, we have a small budget, do some small gardening, do some greenish stuff, etc. And things changed completely during the last 25 or 30 years, where the landscape architect became the one figure which has the lead, which is a very new situation. And this had an effect on the method, not only of landscape architects, but for everyone working together. Because I think one of the main differences between landscape architecture and the other design disciplines is that the landscape architect is someone who very often deconstructs, take things away. In this sense, you're right. I mean, he has to be both active and reactive. So you're reactive because you react to the past. And I think our cities, and not only our cities, our territories in Switzerland, because Switzerland is part of the Western world and it has this success story of the 20th century. And in the 20th century, we had the tradition of filling up. It's a very bourgeois attitude. So you're richer if you have more objects, more cars, more houses, more and more and more. And so our cities and our environments and our houses and our rooms looked like this. So we had to have more and more and more. And I think the aesthetics of the void, it comes, of course, from Asia originally, but it enters by direct and indirect ways, especially the landscape architecture tradition. Take, for example, Dieter Kienast, who is arguably the most famous and most important Swiss landscape architect, who passed away around 2000. And he was very much influenced by people like Isamu Noguchi and many others, you know, aesthetics which came from Asia, partly from Japan, but from the Asian tradition in general, where the void is so important. So I think landscape architecture everywhere, in order to come back to the main problem, is linked to take things away, to fill up, to really give this sense of restraint and create spaces of better living. And because landscape architecture became more and more important, everyone had to adapt to this. And today, I think the evolution goes in this direction too, because we realized, at least in Switzerland, that we won't build so much. The country is already quite built up. We have most of the buildings we need. And so what will happen, that we will plan in the next decades the spaces in between. So we'll plan the void. And I think this is a lesson by landscape architecture, which if you use a term, you could say it became landscape urbanism. So landscape urbanism became reality in Switzerland because of this very recent success story. And this changes the country. This changes the country because if you look to the main places and the main streets and what happens now in most of the Swiss cities, well, the car will exit. The car will slowly but clearly disappearing everywhere in the big cities. And we have a new urban landscape, which is a landscape, maybe not of a complete void, but it's a landscape done for people who are walking and who are sitting there and no more, where people are in the car. And so all this makes a new culture of the void. Individually, some landscape architects and some urbanists may be go in an extreme direction. And in some, we have a mediation and we have mixed forms. But I think this is something which will become more and more important. And coming back just the last time to the idea of the hybrid, we just in the last days, there was a lot of talk about the ski stations. You know, we have these very renowned ski stations where a lot of expats used to live, but now it will be more and more important because people say it's a wonderful possibility to live in the Alps and to have to be connected with the entire world. And if anyhow 90% of your work is done at home, why don't you choose places where you go back to this? You don't go back to the primeval nature, but you go back to a very good compromise between nature and urbanization.
I really appreciate what you're saying about the void, how the plaza is not something generic. It actually is inscribed with, you showed us examples where the plaza could be a theater and these kinds of things. The void is not something that's missing. Of course, it's missing in terms of its massing, but it's actually is inscribed with some kind of use, some kind of participatory function. And I think that speaks to an attitude about urbanism. Now, could we have a comment from Professor Pyeongjun Kang, please?
예, 안녕하십니까. 저는 명지대학교의 강범준입니다.
Pyeongjun from Myongji University. Thank you for that great lecture. And you showed Vassar city and people sitting in front of the lake. The last slide that you showed us was very inspiring, and I wanted to go there when I saw that slide. I have two questions. The first one is, during your presentation, you must have had a certain intention, and I'd like to know what that is. And second question is, there are some parts of your presentation some parts that you didn't put in the presentation, and maybe you did that on purpose. Actually, the first question is as follows. In the hybrid territory of the future, I think you selected 5 themes: infrastructure, piazza, cemetery, and green spaces. And the last one is the waterscape, the waterfront. So these were the 5 themes. It was very interesting. And I think you chose these 5 themes for a specific reason. And then you said, during the past 10, 20 years, you had many waterfronts in Swiss cities that have been developed for citizens. And I think you wanted to tell us that these spaces were being transformed for citizens on the waterfront. That was interesting. And these 5 themes are elements of urban design, and but they're not typical elements of urban design, especially cemetery. So why did you choose these 5 themes, and why did you put cemetery amongst one of the themes that you presented? And I actually thought that you would talk about political space, a space where everybody can celebrate, a historical space, but that wasn't on the list, and you put cemetery on the list. And it's a space that exists so that I can remember somebody who I had a connection and relationship with. Maybe that's why you put it on the list. And in relation with the political space, many cities, including cities in Korea and cities in Europe and other regions, we have political spaces that have a lot of power, and we try to develop a lot of political spaces. I haven't visited many European cities, but when I visit Europe, I feel that they have a smaller number of political spaces compared to other regions. They have a lot of historical spaces, but not that many political spaces. It's the opposite for Korea. We have a lot of political spaces. So what was your criteria for choosing these 5 themes? How did you select these 5 themes? And you focused on the waterfront zone, and in Swiss urbanism, you wanted to stress the waterfront development. So could you elaborate on that also?
Mm-hmm. Okay, so thanks a lot. Maybe let's start with the cemetery. I selected it for 2 reasons. First of all, because of course the cemetery too is a public space, and very much so. And as everything linked to landscape, a cemetery is political space too. So especially in Switzerland, I mean, if we look to the way in which decisions are taken in this country, even for the tiniest cemetery, we have to vote. This means everyone who is living around the cemetery will have to vote for the extension or the transformation. So cemeteries, even if they are tiny and if they look traditionally as being the one thing which is outside of the urban environment or of the main environment, is very much part of it. And I wanted to show you that even something which looks peripheric, which normally you don't look for, is very much the object of design and of responsibility. So it's a sort of metaphor in order to show you, if even the cemetery is taken so seriously, then of course we can start to think that everything becomes a matter of discussion and of thorough discussion and of a serious way to plan. And then secondly, there is really a corpus. I didn't have time there, but I could show you 25 cemeteries, which are all very interesting in the way in which they interact both with the city, with the urban environment, which is sometimes very near, and with the nature. So they are really important spaces, and it's for me, it's a symbol of the quality of landscape architecture, urban design, and design in general in this country. So in this sense, it's typical that in the cemetery becomes an object of such an attention, where the normal psychological reaction will see who cares about cemetery, anyhow the people are dead, so we don't care about them. And on the contrary, I think these are symbolic spaces. And if a country takes seriously a cemetery, and as seriously as it takes a bench in a street, then it means that there is an awareness of what you said, political space. Of course, especially in a place like Switzerland, everything is political space. Even if this private space is of course important, but the private space, my private space is always near another private space. So the political dimension of sharing space is very, very important. And I think I deal normally, especially with landscape architecture and landscape problems linked to the history of landscape. And landscape is a fundamentally political dimension. It's everywhere deals with politics. And Switzerland is I think it's a very good example for an extreme politicization of space.
Great, thank you. Yeah. Well, to follow up on this idea of politics, actually, there's an Can you hear me okay? Can you hear me okay? Oh, he can't hear me.
Yeah, I hear you again now.
Oh, you can hear me okay now. Yes, to follow up this idea about the idea of politics, one kind of underlying current in your talk was the idea that, first of all, the idea of responsibility, but also that fitting into responsibility is aesthetics. And you're kind of skating on dangerous turf here, I would have to say. In a very, it's very provocative. What we see here is in Switzerland is there's an investment, and I think that goes to what you're saying in terms of responsibility. There's an investment in aesthetics. The bridges that you showed were incredibly beautiful, and infrastructural bridges. Also, the use of material, very finely detailed, and even the materials themselves has a certain quality. And I think there's a kind of dangerous Americanization of public space that's happening globally. It's not quite as bad in Seoul and in Korea, but it's infecting our public spaces where if you see quality design and if you see the injection of quote-unquote aesthetics, the taxpayer or the average citizen might think, well, why is the government spending all this money on something beautiful when they can spend it on something else? You know, there's a kind of blanket sort of kickback or kind of resistance against aesthetics. And the negative thing is that then aesthetics is being severed from the idea of public space. But somehow the examples that you showed bypass that. Can you explain, is there something cultural, is there something historical, political? How did this happen? Why are these things so beautiful?
I don't know if we can say that they're a priori beautiful. Aesthetics, which was invented in the 18th century, a philosophical discipline, is of course nothing which is immobile. On the contrary, there is a history of aesthetics. Aesthetic patterns and what we call the taste is permanently in development. It changes. And what we call the beauty of, let's say, Swiss solutions, which may go from the Smith Army knife to the Rolex watch, to bridges, to buildings, to landscape architecture, is linked to the history of taste in the 20th century. So there is a certain pattern which developed in the 20th century where, of course, Switzerland was important. Think of the importance of the Bauhaus and the Werkbund and others. And I think we learned to find this kind of beauty somehow adapted to today's taste. But this is something which is not really natural, or it's not something which is an anthropological value. I think it's linked to very, very complex phenomena, and maybe even to a discourse which finds that this kind of beauty is something which fits into the world we're living to. So I call the Swiss aesthetics, I like to call it sometimes almost Calvinistic or Protestant. You can look, think of the architecture, think of design. It has a lot to do with this extreme sense of restraint, modesty, simplicity, extreme simplification, something which is maybe the result of this long history of living in a country where you have no natural resources, and when we have an incredible respect for the materiality and even for poverty. So maybe the Swiss answer and the Swiss form of beauty, I don't know if it really exists, a Swiss form of beauty, but the form of beauty you encounter when you look to Swiss products, which go from a knife to a building, is linked to this history, which was not always a happy history, which was a history linked to poverty and to far more conflictual, and which somehow fits into the taste of the design of the 20th century. You know, this sense of restraint, it somehow comes together, and the good design, which was promoted by Max Bill with his famous book. Well, at the beginning, it was just the opposite of classical design, of the classical taste. The classical taste of Europe was about things which were bombastic, baroque, filled up. Think of the buildings around 1900, which all look like some incredible cakes with a lot of decoration. And then this possibility to do things which seem necessary with an extreme sense of simplification is something very new in the history of aesthetics. And as we all know, when we plan or design, the simplest solution is the most difficult to find. And I think in Switzerland, whether you look to architecture, to the city, very often we have this sense that simplicity, which doesn't mean primitiveness, simplicity is a very, very important value. So don't use what you don't need, because that's what people do when they have to cope with a difficult situation, when you don't count with abundance. When you live in a world of abundance, then you react differently. So maybe there is an ethics even with the aesthetics. So maybe the aesthetics of Switzerland goes together with a sense of ethics, to be responsible for the material which you use and to give it a good form. And I think something which may be Swiss is part of something more international, of an international trend.
Great, well, thank you. We have time for one question from the audience. Is there anyone that would like to make a comment or question? Or even oh yes, please.
Hi, thank you very much for a wonderful presentation on the historical timeline on the evolution of cities and how built environment have been sort of like appropriating nature. So that dichotomy of urban and nature also somehow reminded me of a current trend here in Korea, which is called urban regeneration. So I agree with you in the importance of time, how time needs to be that kind of judge that kind of temper actions, right? But in the Swiss tradition, how flexible is the system to allow for this urban regeneration? And when I say urban regeneration, mostly it's about turning gray infrastructure into green infrastructure, or like retrofitting former industrial developments. That's a current trend here in Korea, not only in Seoul, but in the entire country. So I wonder how the Swiss tradition is flexible enough to adjust and accept this kind of urban regeneration projects. You said that it needs time and it's a political process, and I guess it's not as easy perhaps to transform spaces as compared to what we have here.
Well, I think temporality is a fundamental dimension in every planning discipline, and here again, the planning disciplines like architecture, urbanism can only learn from landscape architecture, because landscape architecture is always dealing with temporality, with the long term. So we know that important projects of landscape architecture now work on a 5, 25, 50, sometimes 100 years basis. And you're completely right. I don't know how the Switzerland in general will react to this, but as I say, there is a paradox here. Maybe in Switzerland we're used to work with the temporality, with the long time, because we take the time in order to try to anticipate developments which are very, very far away in a temporal sense. So maybe this luxury, which may seem a luxury to take time, is the one answer in order to find solutions for the very, very serious problems which are ahead of us. And I think if you go to a Swiss studio, whether it's in landscape architecture, urbanism, you will find a way to work which is always marked what you said. So to take your time and to try to anticipate in the best possible way the development of the future before finding some very, very rapid answers. So temporality. But I think you're absolutely right. It's a fundamental dimension, and it's somewhere very much present. And I think it should, the temporality, I think about the famous book by David Leatherborough and Moise Mostafavi about weathering. Architecture is equally exposed to temporality because the day where we finish a building, it's first day when it starts to become a ruin. So we have to plan with these things in mind. We have always to take them into consideration if we want to project something which is more sustainable, which has to become green infrastructure, with all the difficulties to define these terms, which we speak easily. We use the term green or greenish or sustainable, but they're all part of a discourse which, if we are honest, is very complicated to put into place.
Great. Well, thank you. We've kept you for a long time, and we made you work very hard with our questions and interrogations. And it was really a privilege to have you come and speak. And we learned so much about that the city, both the city and nature, is constructed. It's literally constructed, but it's also culturally constructed. And I think that lesson that we learned today is going to be important for both of our cities. And it's really a great conversation between Switzerland and Korea that you opened up here. So we really look forward to having you join us in person again. And so I want to thank you once again. You can't really hear the audience, but there are a lot of great reactions, and there's clapping, like we should clap now.
Yeah. Okay, well, thanks a lot. Huh?
And
really,
you know, there's
thanks
a lot of
and I hope we can do it.
Yes,
yeah,
yes.
I hope we can do it personally, the next one. It's a little, you know, the feedback was very, very difficult for the translation. So
yes.
We had a lot of echo, but next time will be better. Yeah,
that's
I'm
right.
looking forward to another possibility.
That's right. That's right. And next time it'll be better. And next time you'll be here in person, and we'll have a great conversation.
Okay, take care. Huh?
Great. Well, thanks so much. And one last announcement is that we have our final Wednesday seminar for those that are here and those that are online next Wednesday at 5 p.m. And we are partnering with the Netherlands Embassy, and we'll have a great speaker, Marina Otero, but also the Future Soul Collaborative Architects and Designers will also be speaking. So thank you again. Hope to see you next Wednesday.
Okay, bye-bye.
Thank you again, Michael, if you're still online. Thank you.
All right, bye-bye.
Bye.